Brighton, England, October 1984. A hidden time bomb brings a huge section of the seafront's Grand Hotel crashing down, whilst British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and members of her cabinet were inside. It is the closest brush with assassination for any British Prime Minister in over 170 years. Taking place 5 years into her 11-year rule as Britain's leader, the assassination attempt comes as Britain is locked into the depths of one of the most significant conflicts of late 20th century Europe, the Troubles. Primarily centred on the British-ruled country of Northern Ireland, the Troubles had a habit of spilling over into other areas, including mainland Britain. At a peak in the tensions during the early 1980s, Thatcher's uncompromising approach to handling the conflict made her a key target for one of the warring factions, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, more commonly known as the IRA. Although she narrowly escaped the blast, the assassination attempt remains one of the most high-profile historical events of both the Troubles and of 1980s Britain. 40 years on, we look at the assassination attempt of Margaret Thatcher in more detail. How the Troubles led to this moment, the bombing itself, and the aftermath of one of the most notorious terrorist incidents in British history. To understand why Margaret Thatcher and her government became targets for assassination, we have to look not only at their role within the Troubles, but the wider context of the Troubles itself, and how they came to be. The history behind the Troubles is much too heavy and complex to fully grapple with in this video, but to put it as simply as possible, it lies in the history of the English and later British colonisation of Ireland. Beginning way back in the 12th century, the colonisation escalated massively with the 17th century plantation of Ulster. Protestant and royalist British settlers moved into this Northern Irish province as a means to control the region, confiscating land from the native Irish landlords. These Protestant settlers maintained a distinct British identity passed down through the generations, an identity vastly different to most of the native Irish. Now, fast forward all the way to the 1920s and the Anglo-Irish War. The majority of Ireland won its independence from Britain, but the Protestant-dominated areas of Ulster, consisting of 6 of Ireland's 32 counties, chose to remain in the United Kingdom. This area became Northern Ireland, a nation entirely separate from the new Irish Free State in the south. Northern Ireland had a sizable Catholic population within its borders, but the tensions that simmered between the Catholic and Protestant communities were not so much to do with religious difference, but in what the two sides represented: Irish nationalism and British unionism. Over the next half-century, the unionist majority dominated Northern Irish politics and used various tactics to marginalise the nationalist minority as much as possible. A Catholic civil rights movement gained steam in the 1960s, but protests and provocations on both sides led to riots that escalated into full-blown paramilitary violence. By the year 1970, the Troubles were well underway. The more extreme fringes of the unionist and nationalist movements that engaged in these paramilitary and terrorist tactics were often referred to by different names: Loyalists and Republicans. The British Army was sent to restore order to the chaos, but their image of being a moderating force was shattered by the Bloody Sunday Massacre of 1972, in which British forces shot 26 unarmed civilians in a nationalist area of the city of Derry. As a result of the massacre, the leading Republican force, the IRA, grew in numbers and prepared for a long struggle against the British state and loyalist paramilitaries, making the destabilisation of Northern Ireland central to their strategy. The aim was to weaken Britain's desire to stay in Northern Ireland, paving the way for an eventual Irish reunification. And this is where Margaret Thatcher comes in. Upon coming to power in 1979, Thatcher made her and her party's stance clear by stating that Northern Ireland was as British as Finchley, her parliamentary seat. Naturally, this drew the ire of Republican paramilitaries, but even more infuriating for them was Thatcher's approach to dealing with Republican prisoners. Back in 1976, the British government withdrew special category status for imprisoned Republican militants in Northern Ireland, classifying them as regular criminals rather than prisoners of war. This served to both delegitimise their political stance and remove their privileges, such as the right to refuse work and to receive 1 visitor per week. Thatcher escalated this situation further by announcing in 1980 that special category status had ended for good. In response to this, Republicans in Northern Ireland's Maze prison went on hunger strikes in 1980 and 81, the latter of which led to the death of 10 prisoners, including Bobby Sands, an IRA member who had stood and won election to Parliament during this strike. The deaths, and Thatcher's uncompromising stance, brought increased Republican support and sympathy across both sides of the Irish border, and intensified the Republican hatred of Thatcher's government. The two separate hunger strikes and the hardline government response to them served to only fan the flames of Irish republicanism. With Thatcher viewed as being directly responsible for the deaths, the IRA quickly turned their attention towards revenge. Even before the 1981 strike was over, the group quickly began plotting Thatcher's assassination, and sent volunteers to attend the annual Conservative Party conferences in 1982 and 1983, held in Brighton and Blackpool respectively. The conference was identified as an ideal moment to strike at the heart of the British government, and when it was set to be hosted in Brighton once again in 1984, the IRA decided that this was their opportunity. Having killed British political and royal figures in the late 1970s, the IRA was no stranger to assassination missions in Britain. But the idea of killing Britain's leader and decapitating her cabinet was beyond anything they'd attempted before. The man selected to build the Brighton bomb was 33-year-old Patrick Magee. He'd already spent time in prison and previously tried to organise the bombing of a pub near some British Army barracks in northwest England. On September 15th, 1984, Magee checked into Brighton's Grand Hotel a few short weeks before several members of the government would be staying there. He smartly requested a room on the upper floors, believing that this would be where Thatcher and her cabinet were most likely to stay, and spent several days assembling a time bomb consisting of over £100 worth of gelignite. Rigged with a very long time delay, the bomb was hidden in a side panel of a bathtub, and Magee checked out of the hotel on September the 18th. A few short weeks later, the Conservative Party conference would begin on October the 9th, with Thatcher herself scheduled to give a speech on the conference's final day of the 12th. In the late evening of October the 11th, Thatcher returned to her room in the Napoleon Suite on the Grand Hotel's first floor. She stayed up until the early hours working on her conference speech, and after making a quick trip to the bathroom at 2:52 AM, just 2 minutes later and 5 floors above her, the bomb exploded. In just a split second, the Grand Hotel was paralysed by a crushing wave of force. The bomb exploded with such violent power that one of the hotel's 5-ton chimneys was dislodged from its position in an instant, smashing through every floor it came into contact with. Over 30 people were injured and 5 were killed, including Conservative MP Sir Anthony Berry. But what of Thatcher? Her and her husband Dennis escaped uninjured, but only by the narrowest of margins. The falling chimney had sighed through rooms ending with the number 8, Thatcher's room ending in 9. She was so close to suffering serious harm that had she been in the bathroom just 2 minutes later than she was, it is very likely she would have been killed in there. Patrick Magee had failed, but he had come within a hair's breadth of changing the course of both the Troubles and of modern British history. As emergency services arrived at the scene and began to search for survivors beneath the rubble, Thatcher was escorted to Brighton Police Station. Despite the whole ordeal, she still made it to the Conservative Party conference as planned that morning, and delivered her speech less than 7 hours after the bomb's detonation. The fine margin of failure was lamented by the IRA, who released a chilling statement straight after the bombing. "Today, we were unlucky, but remember, we only have to be lucky once. You will have to be lucky always. Give Ireland peace, and there will be no war." This clear warning of future action, and the security failure to find the bomb in the 3.5 weeks it was hidden, spurred British authorities into action. Security for major party conferences and for members of Parliament was tightened from that point onwards. Anglo-Irish relations were slightly shaken, but Thatcher's hardline attitude towards Republican militarism was unwavering. Negotiations between the British and Irish governments slowed down as Thatcher came to fear further assassination attempts, but this did not derail the two countries from signing the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985. This gave the Republic of Ireland an advisory role in Northern Ireland's government, an important step forward on a long road to peace. Meanwhile, the IRA continued to commit bombings in Britain, whilst its associated political party Sinn Féin continued to grow its electoral success that had been increasing ever since the hunger strikes. This was a dual Republican strategy termed the Armalite and the ballot box. Despite continuing operations in Britain throughout the 80s and 90s, the IRA never again managed to mount such an ambitious attack on the heart of the British government. When the bomb went off, Magee had been far away in the Irish city of Cork. Knowing that he would be inevitably caught regardless, he committed himself to carrying out further violence in Britain and was arrested in Glasgow in June 1985. Sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 35 years, Magee was released in 1998 following the Good Friday Agreement, which brought the Troubles to an end. Regarding the bombing, he has since said in an interview, "I regret that people were killed. I don't regret the fact that I was involved in a struggle." Amazingly, he has even met multiple times with Jo Berry, the daughter of the murdered Sir Anthony Berry, in an effort at reconciliation. But what if Magee had succeeded? Had Thatcher been killed by the explosion, then her eventual reign of 11.5 years, the longest of any 20th century British Prime Minister, would have been cut to less than half of that. Her successor, John Major, was aged just 41 in 1984 and would have stood no chance of taking over the leadership. A potential Conservative leadership election may have seen Norman Tebbit, who was badly injured in the bombing, or Michael Heseltine, her influential rival who helped bring down her premiership in 1990, succeed Thatcher as Prime Minister. But even more significant than this could have been the bombing's effect on the Troubles. Although Republican terror was a tool intended to weaken Britain's grip on Northern Ireland, the murder of a Prime Minister may well have had the opposite effect, turning British public opinion towards a desire for revenge against the IRA. This in turn could have led to an increase in British Army personnel in Northern Ireland and an emboldening of loyalist paramilitaries, meaning potentially increased violence against Catholics in Northern Ireland, whether nationalist or not. With all this in mind, the successful negotiation of the 1985 Anglo-Irish Agreement could well have been derailed. In this scenario, all of a sudden the road to the Good Friday Agreement takes a sharp turn, and the timeline of the Troubles looks considerably darker, the assassination unleashing community violence to a level not seen since the early 1970s. The inflamed tensions and inevitable scars from the resulting fallout would be sorely felt between the two communities right up to the present day. The Brighton bombing remains a point of fascination in modern British history, a crossroads of fate that marked the closest that any Prime Minister had come to assassination since the year 1812. In the end, Magee did fail, but for the matter of a few feet or a chimney falling at a slightly different angle, and suddenly history is rewritten. Thatcher's tenure is halved, and the Troubles deepened. 40 years on, the Grand Hotel's exterior gives no indication of the destruction that once took place there, a landmark forever etched in history as a place where the IRA were famously unlucky, and Margaret Thatcher and members of her cabinet were very, very lucky indeed. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.